Conference. Eleanor's ministry has explored how to engage congregations and individuals in anti-racism work in the United States and now in Germany. With this, I am excited to introduce my friend and today's speaker, the Reverend Eleanor McCormick.
John, thank you so much for that introduction. It is wonderful to see your face and hear your voice after almost 2 years since my departure from Kansas, which is hard to believe. I am sitting here in Karlsruhe in Baden, part of Baden-Württemberg, Germany. And I am first hoping to express my thanks and gratitude to the entire annual meeting planning team. I know this was an adventure in creativity, and I have so enjoyed being able to participate when I am unable to travel. So many, many thanks to the planning committee and your hard work, and to all those who have made this possible. And I'm going to take you in to a slideshow at this point that has a couple of videos and some music and some discussion points as we tackle this idea of Black Lives Matter crossing the ocean. Okay. Are you now seeing a presentation?
Yes, we are.
Okay, that is good news. Let's make sure this is full screen for you. Okay. So I don't want to assume that all of you are familiar with the Black Lives Matter movement, but I do imagine that the movement, the term, has come across your newspapers, even your dinner tables, possibly your church pew conversations. But I open just with this brief introduction to Black Lives Matter. And I think the most important thing for me to honor and to note is that I am sitting here clearly as a white woman, and we are talking about a movement that was founded by 3 Black women that are pictured here in a Times Magazine layout. This is Patrisse Cullors, Alicia Garza, and Opal Tometi. They are the founders, and they continue to be the lead organizers of the Black Lives Matter movement, which is today truly a transnational movement. The protests following the murder of George Floyd have indeed spread across the globe, even to cities in Germany, which we will speak specifically to today. Where many are rallying behind the Black Lives Matter movement to call for a deeper examination of systemic racial injustice, oppression, and more that exists in a particular context or in their own society. And people here in Germany are using the Black Lives Matter movement to ask some really critical questions that include: what are the historical backgrounds of Black people in Germany? And those historical backgrounds are diverse. In what ways have Black people been accepted or not accepted in German society? What are the historical backgrounds of racism in Germany and racism towards Black people in particular? And what efforts have been made or not made on the side of government and society at large to discuss the issues of racism and discrimination, and in the case of Germany in particular, decolonization? And tonight I'm going to be trying to show you some of the similarities and some of the differences, between the anti-racism movements that are in Germany and in the US, and then be open to your questions to address those as well. But because our theme of annual meeting this year is one of storytelling, I thought I would begin with a story. I feel that I have already learned a lot from Rebecca, one of our keynote speakers, and will try to put some of her wisdom into action as I tell you this story. So I call this story A Day at the Museum. Just a few weeks after arriving in Germany, and just a few days after beginning my job inside of the Evangelische Landeskirche Oberkirchenrat, which is essentially the church headquarters, where all 900 pastors within Baden report for supervision and continuing education and personnel management, I received an email that at that point was a reminder. We're meeting next Tuesday for a Betriebsausflug. I had no idea what a Betriebsausflug was, but I assumed by the wichtige Hoch, that red flag in my email box, that I really should look it up. And so came my new best friend, Leo Dictionary online, entered Betriebsausflug, and realized this was our staff retreat, our outing that would happen once a year, every year, and was something that Germans not only expected their employers to provide, but quote unquote enjoyed partaking of. So here I was, ready for my first Betriebsausflug, and I thought, well, I'm assuming one should dress well. One should exude some confidence as a new employee, if at all possible. And so I bought a new dress. I was ready for my Betriebsausflug. That morning, I jumped on a Straßenbahn and found myself delayed between two stations. And now I was only a few weeks into living in Germany, but I had already learned one of the golden rules: never be late. So not only had I spent money on a new dress for this Betriebsausflug, but I decided to disembark from my Straßenbahn and catch a rather expensive taxi to our meeting point. Of course, I had the taxi driver leave me off just around the corner, so I would look both put together and on time, as Germans should look and should do. To my dismay, I arrived to a circle of new colleagues wearing what I would call frumpy casual, ready for a hike around the harbor. Not a day of conversation and good food and mingling, but a day of walking in 90-degree sunshine. Yes, there was laughter from my own nervousness, but also from new colleagues. But I found myself shortly thereafter with a small group of colleagues to converse with, to travel with, and along that harbor, there's something called a Heimatsmuseum. It is a small museum, not well kept, a place that helps the harbor tell its history and connect people to the changes that have occurred and the transport hub as it exists today. We decided, this small group of colleagues and I, to take a short tour within that museum. We had a German tour guide, and she led us around to the various exhibition spaces and gave us information that we wouldn't have been able to understand on our own. But just a few minutes in, when I was feeling like I finally fit in, I wanted so badly, as you could tell that day, to fit in, to blend in, to somehow be German. It was 5 minutes in when my colleague looked towards me. I thought he was confused, and perhaps the tour guide thought so as well. The tour guide looked past me to him, standing just behind me and to the right of me, and said in German, "Sir, do you need me to speak English?" And when he didn't respond quickly enough, she said in English, "Sir, I'm very happy to speak English if you're having any trouble understanding our tour today." A moment there, I felt good. I felt in. She didn't know I wasn't German. Somehow that day I passed as German, as knowing the German language, which I most certainly did not, and am still struggling to know today. But she targeted my colleague, my Ethiopian colleague who has very dark skin. She stopped her tour to be sure that he, who she presumed to be from another country, unable to speak German, she turned to Kifle Mariam, and only Kifle Mariam, to ask him if he had the understanding that I didn't have. And I got that gut feeling, that gut churning feeling when you're standing as a bystander to a microaggression. And I can honestly say that I deeply regret that I did not say anything in that moment. But following our tour, I did speak to Kifle Mariam, and I said, "Kifle Mariam, in English, that would be a microaggression, and that would hurt." And I was the one that didn't have a clue, that was missing every other word. And I know you in that moment were targeted because of the color of your skin. That was my first story around racism in Germany. And I have a brief interview with Kifle Mariam that we will see in the next few slides. But first, let me proceed here. The assumption is that if you're Black, you are not, nor will you ever be, German. And I didn't write what Kifle Mariam said to me that day in our discussion, but I'm pretty sure these words reflect his feeling and what he did share with me rather well. And this comes from a Black Lives Matter movement leader in the city of Berlin. And again, since spring of this year, I have been watching social media very carefully in Germany, trying to follow social media and hashtags that are pertinent to this theme of Black Lives Matter crossing the ocean and racism in the context of German society. And this comes from a German influencer, and I think it speaks, 1,000 words with these little emojis. And he did write this in English, and it gained a lot of traction, a lot of commentary, and again, speaks to that experience that I had with a colleague weeks after arriving here to serve in a very progressive denomination, to serve in a very progressive state, one of 16 states in Germany that is led by the Green Party, left of center, and concerned about these issues. And yet you're seeing, and I was seeing, I should say, microaggression. I remember Reverend Day McAllister coming to Plymouth Congregational Church in Lawrence and saying that microaggressions end up feeling like 1,000 paper cuts, just cut after cut, day after day. And I hold that, that image that she gave me. I think we all know what a paper cut feels like, but to imagine thousands of them coming at you, and this really continues to be a theme in my relationship with Kifla Mariam, and in my conversations with colleagues who are Black, Indigenous people of color. So I want to play for you this song. It is very new. It was released at the end of August here in Germany. The title of it is Nie wieder leise, which translates roughly to no longer silent or no longer quiet or can't keep quiet. And it features soloists and faces of many leaders in the Black Lives Matter movement here in Germany and in the anti-racism literature and movement also here in Germany. It was put out by a well-known artist named Selena Bostic, and it does have English subtitles. So I thought it was quite worth sharing with you today. So I'm going to be sure I share my computer sound with you. And if you have any trouble seeing or hearing this, don't hesitate to wave. I can see John and Bobby right now, particularly. All right. Okay. You know what? I am going to show you the interview from Kifla Mariam because it just loaded. So we're going to transition to Kifla Mariam first. This is me on a split screen Zoom call with him because he couldn't make time this evening to be with us. He had another seminar conflict. So this is Kifla Mariam Gebrewald, beloved friend and colleague of mine in the Evangelische Landeskirche in Germany. He'll tell you a little bit about himself, and this is our exchange, which I thought would really give you some personal data points, and always good to hear from someone who's not me. So here is Kifla Mariam Gebrewald. He is a peace and justice expert within the church. He deals with demilitarization, so very political work within the church, trying to reduce arm exports and arm imports in Germany and beyond. And here is our brief conversation. Oh, come on. I'm here this afternoon, honored to speak with a colleague of mine, Kifla Mariam Gebrewald, to ask him a few short questions and to share his perspectives with you in this time of conversation and this time of listening as we address Black Lives Matter crosses the ocean. So Kifla Mariam, my first question to you is, how has the conversation on Black Lives Matter changed? How has anti-racism work been elevated in Germany over the past few months?
I think I have been living in this country for 28 or so years. This is the first time that issues related to racism have come up in such a way, in such intensity and with such a force that quite a number of people are really puzzled. For once, I think the second and third generation of migrants living in this country, we have a number of migrants of African descent from the Arab world, from Asia, especially from Turkey and other places. So the issue of Black Lives Matter has somehow galvanized all these groups, and a lot of the issues are actually from what we see in the US. The younger generations are reading books and articles from African American or other people in the US who have already been working and thinking and exploring this issue of racism. And so it has become on the front line of many newspapers and TV shows and radio programs. And the younger generation in this country has started to pick up this issue within their own circles. I have had my daughters being asked by by colleagues or by neighbors, please introduce us into this issue, recommend us some books, or would you be able to come and share with us your experience? So as much as the situation in the US is terrible, at the same time, it is also the US that has got one of the best scholars and some of the best outspoken civil rights leaders and church leaders who have talked about this issue and are able to explain also what it means for the society.
And have you seen the Black Lives Matter movement take on the specific context of Germany? Have you seen the Black Lives Matter itself be engaged by church people or by the various regional Protestant churches that are across Germany?
For now, I think the issue of racism has been discussed very much. Largely, it went up to the head of state of this country, of Germany, the president, who has made a talk about this issue specifically. It has reached a number of companies, private companies, who are openly talking and debating about this issue, because obviously they have understood the dynamics behind it, and apparently also they have clearly seen what it means for their business, having a problem with racism, what that means for their business. So I think the contextualization within the German society, that is the next task to be taken. After all, we cannot hide or forget the terrible historical legacy of Germany. It was based on racism that the Nazi regime eliminated millions of people who were non-Aryans. So there is a lot of historical knowledge and a lot of thinking that is available in this country. But now the challenge for this German society today is, what does racism mean within the German context of today? How do we operate? What does it mean for the young people? What does it mean for the second and third generation within this country? I think that's where we are now, and that applies more or less also for the churches, the different churches, Protestant churches, but also for the other churches. The real issue is how to understand that obviously racism doesn't stop at the gate of a church. It is part of society, and hence we will find it everywhere. And here again, there is also a certain legacy of the German churches, may they be Protestant, Catholic, or otherwise. After all, Germany had colonies, and during the colonial time, the churches were part and parcel of the colonial adventure. And I think we need to see also an apology for the wrongdoings in the former German colonies by the German churches. They have done to a certain extent, but it has to be done, I think, in a more inclusive and a more publicly available form, and it has to relate to what racism means today also within faith-based organizations.
Oops, not you hearing me now. I am so sorry.
Yes.
You now have had a chance to meet Keith Lamagam Gay-Valent, to hear a little bit from him. This interview was quite a bit longer than I expected, than he expected. So I might find a way of sharing more with you when we have a bit more time. But I think he provides several very important insights into the topic at hand today. So we've been kind of talking around the edges of what the Black Lives Matter movement has looked like in Germany. And I think this picture is one of the best photos to describe it. This was a protest, a Black Lives Matter sponsored protest in Berlin on June 6th. And you can see this is Alexanderplatz in Berlin, the largest former communist meeting grounds, essentially. If you have traveled to Berlin, I'm quite sure you have been in this place before, and you see what ended up being a count of about 25,000 people. And we saw these protests around Germany, especially on June 6th, including cities like Munich, here in this photo, where you see a mix of English and German cardboard signs, and you see the crowd of all different hues and skin colors. You also see that this is in the midst of Corona, of course. Some of the protests that occurred in Germany were what have been called Menschenkette, where you make a line of people with your arms stretched out for that 2-meter Abstand or safety distance between you. You wear a mask and you have that Menschenkette go across a city or major intersections, highways, business and commerce areas. So you have pictures like the one you're seeing right now as pretty emblematic of what's happening in big cities, but also these Menschenkette have really caught on as people are trying to balance Corona regulations and protections and protesting racism. Now, I wonder if any of our Coral Gables folks, Florida folks, are joining us, who are joining us are from Germany. I can't see all of your hands, so maybe if you would unmute, if we have.
I'm actually not from Germany, but my husband's from Germany and I've lived there for quite a while.
Okay, so when you see this image, do you know immediately where we are?
I would guess it's the East Side Gallery in Berlin.
Absolutely right. Yay, this worked. Do you want to say anything about that? I don't mean to put you on the spot.
Sure. So I'm sure probably most of you know Berlin during the Cold War was divided between the east and western halves, and there was a big wall that went through it. 31 years ago, I guess this year, that wall came down, and the first instinct I think of people was to smash it to smithereens and sell the pieces. But then people started to realize, oh, maybe we should preserve parts of the wall because there were a lot of it was a piece of history. And a lot of the people who had painted on it made really beautiful things. So a big section in the eastern part of Berlin now has old parts of the wall that are either kept the way they were, or they're routinely painted with like new murals dedicated to more relevant contemporary topics.
Exactly. Thank you so much. That
You're
was
welcome.
perfect. Incredibly helpful. Exactly where I was hoping we could go with this. And so this appeared within weeks of George Floyd's murder. And it also had quite a bit of traction on social media. I shared it because I was so moved by this idea of the wall being used to talk about the oppression that was being felt in a very visceral way, the murder that was being felt in a very visceral way. And this space in Berlin, like you just described so beautifully, is a space where art becomes protest, and where art can invoke memorial, where art can invoke prayer, where art often invokes anger. But this free space that in this case really brought the world together around a moment in time and a violent death, and around the topic of police brutality that is not owned by America by any means. Many of you may have seen this article, came out just a few days ago in the New York Times. Maybe by a show of hands, how many of you already saw this? So a number. I loved that this came out just before I was doing this presentation, having this time with you, because I realized just how relevant our time would be, how necessary this time would be, and how interesting it would end up being as well. And I think the byline really does sum it up. The Black Lives Matter movement really saw these protests that were clear signs of solidarity and empathy, and listening to America, learning from America. But there's also a feeling in Germany that Germans are reluctant, white Germans are reluctant, the German government is reluctant to dig deeper, to look at meaningful solutions, and to kind of do more than what would be good for their image, I would say. And much of this work is hard work that needs to be done. Not unlike the hard work that is being done and needs to be done and needs to continue to be done in the American context. And there were two things that Keith Lamariam brought up that deal directly for me with this quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates. First, he brought up colonization and Germany's long and unexamined history of colonization, particularly in what is modern day Namibia, where many would consider what the German colonial powers did there to be genocide, to be a genocide that predates the Holocaust, that predates World War II. And Keith Lamariam also brought up the idea of a public apology that might or might not include reparations, but an apology that is also a denouncement that would come not just from the government, from secular society, but would come in Germany also from the churches, who were certainly implicit, if not complicit, in colonization, and in the breaking up of Africa into capitalistic colonies that were mined for their human resources and their mineral resources and much more. And I now want to connect that colonization to what Ta-Nehisi Coates says here. It is as though we have run up a credit card bill and having pledged to charge no more, remain befuddled that the balance does not disappear. When I was working on white privilege and anti-racism work in the US, I would often encounter folks who would say, church folks, non-church folks, who would say, we ourselves have never owned slaves, or we never say the N-word. And this idea that we don't then reckon with what happened before us, what got us to this place, what balance is out of sight, but is still very much with us and affecting us in so many named and unnamed ways. And in talking to white Germans or Germans that identify as white, there's this sense that they want to be absolved of their racism or of the colonial history of their country. But that desire comes without very much knowledge of colonialism, comes without very much dedication to examining colonialism, and even being unaware of how colonialism still works its way into children's games in Germany and into everyday language and terminology. And so I think while this quote was written by an American and stands for the American context, it absolutely applies to the German context and to the work of the Black Lives Matter movement here in Germany. So when you look at the Black Lives Matter movement and its various chapters across the country here, the country of Germany, you're looking at a very explicit mention of Schwarze Geschichte, or Black German history. And this is my translation. So Black people, this is my translation of a declaration in the Black Lives Matter chapter of Berlin, where it says, Black people have been part of German society for centuries, and therefore we are also part of the country's history. Yet we are structurally hidden or described as alien with regard to the local culture of remembrance and history. And this local culture of remembrance, is that remembrance around the Holocaust and the genocide of Jewish people. Our work seeks to give Black people access to their history in order to foster a sense of past and present. So it's similar to the Black Lives Matter movement in the US. There is a real focus on education, education that begins in the schools and also transpires in what movies are available, what TV networks are saying and who they're showing, you name it. But this education around Black history is a key point within the kind of manifesto of the Black Lives Matter movement here. And this quote I read just a few days before it was published in the New York Times, and literally, just sucked in my breath in reading it. We have no racism problem in the police here, and this comes from the Interior Minister of my current home state of Baden-Württemberg. And I think this kind of declarative statement really highlights how much work needs to be done, and also the walls that are being put up, the refusal to look at something that is very much present. And this comes just days after neo-Nazi units, secret units within several state police departments in Germany were uncovered and widely publicized. And so to see this kind of statement from a public official was very disheartening and also very relevant to what we are talking about. And yet there are many loud and passionate voices, and now I do want to play this video for you so that you can hear from Selina Bostic and you can see some of the faces of the movement here in Germany. So this is Nie wieder leise, and again, it should have subtitles for you.
Ich schau in den Spiegel und will jemand anders sein. Ich bin ein braves Kind, warum bin ich ganz allein? Ich bin doch so klein, warum fall ich trotzdem auf? Ich fühle mich so unwohl in meiner Haut. Solange ich den Spiegel meide, kann ich mein Licht nicht sehen. Ich such mir falsche Freunde, die nichts verstehen. Ich lach bei Witzen mit, die auf meine Kosten gehen. Senke den Blick, schlucke die Tränen. Ich war so lange leise, ich war so lange leise. Betonung auf wahr. Ich beiße mir auf die Zunge, obwohl mir nach Schreien ist. Ich war so lange leise, aber ich bleib es nicht. Jetzt sag ich, was ich fühle, weil ich weiß, dass ich muss. Sing mir den Kloß aus dem Hals, werf mir den Stein von der Brust. Schau in den Spiegel, was ich sehe ist wunderschön. Ich weiß, warum ich schreibe und für wen. Kann euch nicht schützen, ich kann euch bloß zeigen. Wir haben eine Stimme, wir müssen nicht schweigen. Wir waren so lange leise, wir waren so lange leise. Waren so lang wir waren so lange leise, wir waren so lange leise. Wir sind
Okay, can you hear me again? Yeah, perfect. I'm gonna go back into presenter mode. I'm sorry about that minor glitch. So you will have seen at the end of that video several names that were being thanked. And I'm glad actually for the technological glitch, because I always feel like I need to sit with that music video after seeing it. After seeing it about a dozen or more times, I mean, just now feel like you get those chills from the impact of the very simple verses to the people's whose eyes that you are looking into. And yes, absolutely, I want to get to questions. I just wanted to give you the names of those people. Two of the most prominent names and faces you saw. One was Alice Hasters. And these are two of the most popular books at this moment on anti-racism work in Germany. So what white people don't want to hear but should know about racism. And then Topaka Ogeta, a book called Exit Racism, that takes many tools that were developed in English and translates them into German and German context, including the invisible knapsack that many of you will have used if you engaged the white privilege curriculum in the United Church of Christ. If you are a German reader, I would recommend both these titles to you. And then I wanted to make you aware of one investment that the church has made, a very intentional investment of thousands of dollars to fully translate the white privilege Let's Talk curriculum into a German version called Weiße Privilegien, Lass uns reden. And this curriculum is going to be traveling across Protestant regional churches in Germany and hopefully having a very valuable impact. And this is a focus of my work at this moment. And one of the first seminars where we're presenting this translation is coming up just next Thursday in a state to the north of Baden. But this is where our partnership, where the Kansas-Oklahoma Conference, the work and time and investment we have put into this discussion as a conference is actually making an impact in Germany. This curriculum is galvanizing, and this curriculum is helping the German churches not start from zero, but start with this huge lead in doing this work and doing this work faithfully, which is so important. And this is where I leave you with the bishop of our Baden church, writing a letter actually to the conference in Edith, June 4th of this year, and asking his own church, asking the Baden church, would we be courageous enough to act in a similar way? And I think that's what we all need to ask ourselves. Can we find the courage to do this work and to maintain the courage that is needed to do this incredibly important and faithful work together? And now I really do want to move to questions, and I am honestly willing to stay past noon as well. So I will hand it over. I believe Michael or John are moderating.
Thank you, Eleanor. So last night, if you were with us, we had some questions in the chat, and so feel free to leave questions in the chat for Eleanor. Eleanor, there's one from Chris Moore who asks, are there any discussions going on about reparations? And if so, what do they look like?
So I'm hoping you can see me and not my screen share at this point. Is that correct?
We can see you.
Okay, Perfect. So Chris, thank you for that question, and thank you for the bridging question from last night's discussion to today. Yes, there are discussions about reparations. I think the most current discussion is about Namibia specifically, and the genocide that occurred in Namibia. The German government made an initial offer, you could say, for reparations, and it was rejected by the Namibian government. And so this is a current ongoing discussion. There's quite a lot of literature and journalism being published on the topic. I believe that there's some in English from Deutsche Welle, and could share that if it is relevant to you. And it was rejected, the offer, with citations that it was far too low, almost embarrassingly low as a starting number. And I don't want to misspeak about how much it was, but outright rejected, and discussions are ongoing. Kind of connected to reparations is, of course, this apology and also rejection of apology for colonialism, rejection of colonialism and its continued effects on German society. And I think this is where the United Church of Christ could also share materials with Baden and with Germany. Our repudiation of the doctrine of discovery that Sarah talked about last night is certainly a powerful model of repudiation. And so how does the church speak before reparations are paid, or in light of advocating for reparations to be paid? We also have to do that work of apology and ownership.
I just want to point out for people that are listening that this coming Tuesday, the United Church of Christ nationally is holding what's called Tuesdays for Nurture, and they will be focusing on the doctrine of discovery. So I'll send that out in the email so you can register for that. Let's see, a couple more questions. This comes from Donna Chung, who's in Hawaii visiting us as a guest. Could you speak to the white privilege curriculum and how you envision its impact on the United Church of Christ in America? Does this differ from your vision of its impact in Germany?
That's a very good question. White privilege is not the buzzword that I found it to be in my American church context. Racism is being discussed, anti-racism work, but the concepts behind white privilege are, I would say, not even in their infancy here in Germany. So I think it's going to be very interesting to see what work we have to do prior to engaging the Weiße Privilegien Lass uns reden curriculum in order to have it have the impact we desire. And this seminar that I will attend next week is not open to the public. It's really a sort of think tank to get at that very question. So I think my fair answer to say to you, or to answer to you, is that we don't know yet. But I feel that the church can be a multiplier in this work, a very, very critical multiplier. And I saw the impact of that curriculum, of the white privilege curriculum, in Kansas in that way as well. We could start small and it very quickly move beyond our control, multiplying into new contexts and spaces and relationships, because it kind of birthed this very thoughtful group of people who had done some hard work and were committed to continuing the work, I think is fair to say.
Eleanor, could I say, is there a difference? The church in Germany, at least the Church of Baden, has a lot more authority than the United Church of Christ does.
Right.
And so when they send out a curriculum or decide to do something, their churches kind of do it, which is radically different.
Right.
Than we do here.
Yeah, our synod, so our governance structure, our synod speaks for the church. And we often say in the United Church of Christ that our synod speaks to the church. So when the synod votes to take a theme, usually much more than a curriculum, but a stance on something like, for instance, becoming a just peace church or becoming an anti-racist church, then it would be provided with a lot of resources and a lot of kind of binding protocols. You know, you should do this and when and how, and please change your confirmation materials to include, and you know, please be sure you take this specific offering, etc. I mean, we're all church people here, so we can imagine how that would work. But yes, if the church decided to take this seriously, in some sense, the impact of it could be accelerated by our very hierarchical structure.
So it is 1 o'clock, and Eleanor has graciously agreed to stay on for a few more minutes. I know there's a couple more questions, so maybe Eleanor, you could take a look at the chat. But I want to pass this to Bobby for some closing remarks, and then we can wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you, Eleanor. It was fascinating, really, and so connected in many ways to last night. And thank you for joining us and for being willing to stay a little longer. This is really important stuff. We don't often have the opportunity to see how a movement here it impacts the rest of the world and other countries, especially through faith communities. I think we still tend to think of ourselves as the center of the universe. But this partnership gives us such a rare opportunity to ask and struggle with these questions together in ways that span borders, borders of the ocean, borders of cultures, and borders of countries. So thank you for joining us in planting and nurturing this seed of possibility. So we have reached another point of recess, which brings us to announcements and a reminder that there is no session this evening. But in the morning, again, remember to check your email for the links. We have 2 workshops on the agenda for tomorrow, one from 10 to 11 and another from noon to 1:30. And then our next plenary at 7 o'clock. And Eleanor is willing to stay, and following her closing prayer, we will be in recess until our morning prayers tomorrow. And it is Thursday already. The week has gone quickly. So I will turn it back to Eleanor and Michael and any of you who want to remain on the line. And then Eleanor will close us with a final prayer.
Eleanor, this question comes from Peter Lucky, and he says, as we witness the strength of extreme white supremacy groups in the United States. We know also that there are far-right movements like the AfD in Germany. Is the strength growing of these groups in Germany?
Yes. Unfortunately, the strength of groups like the AfD, which is an officially recognized political party in Germany, is growing, as are more secretive branches of far-right extremism, like the neo-Nazi cell within an entire police department. I think we're seeing this on a global scale, growth in populism and far-right extremism, and certainly Donald Trump adds fuel to those fires, and is often lifted up as a great encourager, a great hero of these movements. And I do think that the pandemic has in some ways tapped down far-right extremism in Germany. And I don't think I'm alone in holding that opinion. It would be a longer discussion of how and where, but their approach to the pandemic has not been well received, whereas Angela Merkel, in a more centrist party, has led a response that in a majority sense has been well accepted and trusted.
I think Rachel Pryor had to go, but she did ask a question, and we're recording this, so we'll put this in for later. What does systemic racism look like in Germany? Is incarceration disproportionate to race? Is income unequal? Is representation disproportionate? What are your thoughts on that?
A lot of thoughts. Yes, it is systemic in Germany. We've already talked a little bit about policing, which I think is something that looks very different in Germany for a lot of reasons, but can still be brought into this discussion about systemic racism. Most recently, I would say that representation has been coming up. Since the refugee crisis in Germany, demographics in Germany have changed and are changing, and yet we're not seeing a similar pace of change within elected officials, within those who essentially hold power. And you know, it can be seen as a microaggression, it can be seen as systemic racism, but just small things like your last name. Does it sound German, right? On a job application, on a housing application, before you have an image of someone, a lot of images are drawn out of German naming. Do you have a German name? And I can tell you, as Eleanor McCormick, just nonstop comments. You know, where does your name come from? Does your family have tractors? Does your family have the spices? You know, they know I am not German. And this affects racism throughout so many systems, but especially through systems like hiring and firing and housing and yeah, longer discussion, but I hope that does some service to Rachel's question.
Eleanor, I want to invite you. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Donna.
Now that you have this perspective working in Germany and you look back on your work in Kansas, are there things you can tell us about how you see this curriculum, how you see our church, the UCC, in this work, moving things forward?
I see the United Church of Christ as a very brave and loud voice on this, essentially in this new line, I shouldn't say new line of work. Here as an ecumenical pastor, I can honestly say that I am more often proud of my denomination than I expected to be. I love that we have so many resources to share, and we have done so much groundwork that can build up the ecumenical church, not just here in Germany where I serve now, but globally. I think we could be a bit more prideful, as hated as that word can be at times, a little bit louder about walking the walk and doing the work. And with all of these points of digital contact, it's really a beautiful thing to say one church to another or one pastor to another. We've already invested a lot of time and energy. Why don't you try to take it from here as opposed to reinventing the wheel? The German church in which I serve can get, I'm going to say this diplomatically, can easily get stuck in due process and right theology, and be left without the curriculum it needs, or the Bible studies it needs, or the conversation partners it needs when it needs them. So in a moment like this, when the pandemic is pulling any Band-Aids that still existed off and showing us the depth of our wounds around racism, the church cannot be silent. I mean, just like that beautiful music video, we cannot be silent. Black and Indigenous people of color in Germany cannot be silent. And if the church is too slow in creating these relevant tools for people to learn and grow, we will miss the moment. And we will be deemed less relevant, or at least that's my perspective.
Thank you so much for that.
I hope that addressed your question, Donna. Both of your questions I will continue to be sitting with. Thank you.
Eleanor, with that, I wonder if you might lead us in a closing prayer this afternoon.
Absolutely. First, I want to encourage you to actually scroll through your gallery. If you haven't already been doing that through my whole entire conversation, maybe you already got bored, maybe you already wanted to wave and chat to your friends, but slowly for me, just go through, look at the people who are gathered in these little thumbnail pictures, try to make some eye contact with some folks, try to hold those folks who have names or still images in your mind's eye for a moment, and realize how much beauty is here and how many minds and hearts are gathered around this table that Christ created, and that Christ imbues with the Holy Spirit. What I have learned most about the power of the Black Lives Matter movement and the power of doing this work in a church setting is that we don't do this work alone. We can't do this work alone. We need each other, and we need the unique beauty that each one of us has to offer. to be present, and to be in conversation. And so really to begin this time of prayer, honoring the eyes that we see across this screen and the lives that are being lived by the people who have taken an hour of their day to be here. And let us bring those eyes, those hearts, those hands, those minds, all beloved by God, into a moment of prayer. O beloved one, help us to find the right words. Help us to retrieve those words that seem too late, too small, not enough, not quite right. And help us to build a new language of love and dignity with the words that you help us dig out from this soil. God, help us to be unafraid of getting our hands dirty, of finding the dirt beneath our fingernails days after an encounter or a conversation or a moment. And God, carry these hands that are ready to do your work and to offer your love in a world that so needs it. For we are your people and you are our God. We walk with you in strange times and upon an unfamiliar and broken ground. But yes, God, we are saying yes, God, to getting our hands dirty again and again, knowing that one hand at least, is always held by you. Amen.